Having seen what you saw up close for 4 years, do you think there is a danger in Donald Trump being president again?
Well, I'll always be proud of the record of the Trump-Pence administration. And for 4.5 years, President Trump was not only my president, but he was my friend. We worked very closely to create a record of prosperity at home, 7 million good-paying jobs. We rebuilt our military. We saw more than 300 conservatives appointed to our courts. We took down the ISIS caliphate. We brought about peace in the Middle East. But obviously, it didn't end well. And while the president and I parted amicably, I believe as we look to the future that we'll have better choices. And I'm very confident Republican primary voters will choose wisely in the days ahead about who should be our standard bearer. But again, I'll always be grateful for the opportunity to have been vice president during 4 consequential years in the life of this nation.
Former Defense Secretary Mark Esper said Mr. Trump is unfit for office. Do you agree?
Well, as I said, the president and I were very different. But we worked together very closely. And I think the combination and the entire team in our administration created a record that, frankly, the American people cherish, particularly in the wake of the failed policies of the Biden administration at home and abroad, whether it be the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, whether it be an economy now in a recession, a gusher of spending in Washington, D.C. that's ignited the worst inflation in 40 years. Everywhere I've gone for the last 2 years, Margaret, I've heard people tell me that they want to get back to the policies of that administration. The Trump-Pence administration delivered for the American people. But I truly do believe that the time's call for leadership that can unite our country around our highest ideals and demonstrate the kind of respect and civility that I think the American people show each other every day.
Will you support the Republican Party's nominee, even if it is Mr. Trump?
Well, I look forward to being involved in the process in some way. I can tell you that my wife and I will take some time when our kids are home this Christmas. It'll be the first time in 3 years with 2 in the military that we'll all be together. And we're going to give prayerful consideration about what role we might play. And you know, whether we are in the debate as a candidate or in the debate simply as an active Republican, I look forward to getting behind the Republican cause and supporting candidates around the country, as well as our nominee, to get this country turned back to the policies that'll make us strong and prosperous again.
That sounds like you'd prefer he's not the nominee, but you didn't say no.
Well, I just think there'll be better choices. And, you know, I hold the view, Margaret, that no one could have beaten Hillary Clinton except Donald Trump in 2016. You know, as I write in my book, So Help Me God, I actually endorsed another candidate in the primary in Indiana. But when I saw the way Donald Trump came through Indiana and inspired people who literally felt left behind by the elites in Washington, D.C., literally for decades, I knew that he was going to be elected president of the United States. Republican primary voters knew we needed a fighter in the White House. We needed to have that energy that could turn back the policies of the American left. But I think now calls for a different time. I think the American people will want to see us move forward, solve some of the intractable problems that have literally gone unsolved for more than a generation. And I think everywhere I go, the encouragement that I've received is always predicated on the message that we love the record, but we'd like new leadership. And I'm confident Republican primary voters will give us just that in whoever the man or woman is that is our standard bearer.
You know, you talk about moving forward. The idea of relitigating the 2020 election continues to circulate, as you know that, amongst members of your party. Homeland Security is warning of the risk of political violence, and they have drawn a direct line between domestic violent extremism and this false belief that the 2020 election was somehow rigged. Do you think that continuing to push these claims, as the former president does, is a direct threat?
The 2020 election was not stolen. We have a process in this country where states conduct elections. Questions of irregularities or fraud are then adjudicated in the courts. The states then certify electoral votes. And as we did on January 6th, in the wake of that terrible violence, the role of the Congress is to open and count those votes and to certify the election. We did that. And Joe Biden was elected President of the United States of America. But I do think there's been far too much talk questioning the integrity of our elections. I'm all for election reform. I'm glad to see states around the country that are strengthening election integrity. Because the truth is there were irregularities in the election, even where there wasn't ever evidence of widespread fraud, Margaret. In the state of Wisconsin.
50 lawsuits at the state and federal level that were shut down, that were put forward by the former president.
The state of Wisconsin, their Supreme Court found that that their state had actually violated their election laws in 2 instances a year after the election. The Supreme Court of the United States sequestered votes that had come in beyond the deadline in Pennsylvania. There were irregularities, and I think the American people do well to continue to strengthen election integrity. But those that continue to propagate language that undermines our election, including those who, following the 2016 election, referred to it as stolen. You know, it's remarkable to me, as much attention as there is in the national media on election deniers, that there's little talk about the fact that Hillary Clinton said for years that our election was stolen. She and members of her party blamed Russia and our campaign for colluding, of course, all of which turned out to be itself a fraud.
But I don't have to tell you that January 6th was a horrendous and unique event predicated on this false claim, which is why I wanted to ask you about that. According to a CBS tally, there are going to be 156 members of Congress that will be sworn in January who continue to raise questions about the validity of the 2020 election. That's more than back in 2020. Isn't that a risk? Doesn't the party need to stop that?
Well, look, there's a First Amendment in this country that people can hold the opinions that they hold, even if I disagree with them. But I have every confidence that the new Republican leadership in the Congress, the new Republican majority, when Nancy Pelosi hands the gavel to Kevin McCarthy, is going to draw the lessons from the midterm campaign, which, for me, give evidence of the fact that that the American people want the Republican Party, and frankly all of our leaders, to be focused on the future. Look, the people of this country are going through a lot right now. The cost of groceries, the cost of living going through the roof, the cost of a tank of gasoline up 60%, crime in our major cities, the worst crisis on our southern border in history. And I think what you're going to see is Republican leadership in the Congress that's going to focus on those issues. And I think that's where the American people want us focused.
Did it surprise you then that Republicans didn't end up with a larger margin, given all the factors you just laid out, which were arguably in their favor?
I was surprised. I was disappointed at the outcome of the election in that regard. Although, you know, I was there, Margaret, as I write in my book, I was there the last time that we defeated Nancy Pelosi's majority, and I'm looking forward to the day that Kevin McCarthy is elected Speaker of the United States House and leads a Republican majority. A win is a win. But I would have liked to have seen more Republicans elected to the Congress. I would have liked to have seen a Republican majority in the Senate. And my conviction is that as you look around what happened on Election Day, candidates that were focused on the future, candidates that were focused on the issues that the American people are focused on, did quite well in the main. I think of Governor Brian Kemp in Georgia, who went through a contentious primary in what people said was a divided Republican electorate, won decisively.
Opposed by the former president?
It was indeed.
Endorsed by you.
And I was proud to support Governor Brian Kemp in that primary. But then he went up against unquestionably the most formidable Democrat candidate in the country, and he won handily. But Brian Kemp, like so many other candidates around the country, was focused on the future and on what people of the country were dealing with every day. By contrast, I think the candidates that were focused on the past, focused on
2020.
relitigating the past, did not fare as well. And it's my conviction that the Republican Party is going to earn the right to lead this country in the days ahead on an increasing basis, that we've got to be known as the party of the future. And I'm confident that new Republican leadership in the House of Representatives, Senator McConnell and Republicans in the Senate will do just that.
Party of the future would mean not the party of Trump. That sounds like what you're saying.
Well, as
Do
I
I have
said,
that right?
Look, that's up to the American people. Particularly, it's up to Republican
You had
primary
such
voters.
an eyewitness view, sir, for 4 years. You
did.
have a credibility to say to the American public whether there is a risk or not of him being commander-in-chief.
Well, Margaret, look, January 6th was a tragic day. I'll always believe that I did my duty under the Constitution and the laws of this country in the midst of that. And I've been very clear, as I am in my book, that the president's words and actions in and around January 6th were reckless. The tweet that he issued the day that I was in the loading dock below the United States Senate endangered my family and endangered people that were in the Capitol, and was indefensible. But I must tell you that I couldn't be more proud of the response of Republican and Democrat leaders in the Congress who came together. The response of Capitol Hill police and federal law enforcement that quelled the violence made it possible for us to reconvene the Congress on the very same day of that riot and complete our work under the Constitution. As I say that in the book, I believe a day of tragedy became a triumph of freedom.
And you've received bipartisan praise for having done that.
But beyond all of that, I don't want to confuse the tragedy of that day with with the extraordinary accomplishments of our administration. I mean, when you think at home and abroad, the progress that we made, 7 million good-paying jobs, unemployment at a 50-year low, by cutting taxes, rolling back regulation, unleashing American energy, we created unbridled prosperity in this country. And on the foreign policy stage, of which you're a well-known expert, with the direction of our commander-in-chief, the armed forces of the United States crushed the ISIS caliphate, took down their leader without one American casualty, held Assad in Syria accountable when he used chemical weapons on his own people, reestablished the credibility of American force.
This sounds like a campaign platform issue for you.
Well, no, for me, Margaret, it really is.
Because you're going to have to defend the administration you served in.
For me, it is all evidence of what we were able to do during the 4 years of the Trump-Pence administration. And while we had our critics then and today and in the future, I'll always be proud of what we did for this country. We left America stronger and more prosperous than any time in my lifetime. And while it didn't end well, I'll always be proud of the record that we created for the American people.
I have interviewed you many times throughout the years, and I always know you to be very measured and very careful with your words. But I think a lot of Americans, when they saw those pictures of you with your family, with your daughter, with your wife, with your brother, sheltering for your lives that day, would ask, why did it take you 2 years to talk about your anger? Weren't you incandescent with rage that your family was put at risk like that?
Margaret, I was angry that day and many days since. But on January 6th, I have to tell you that I had to put that aside. The president had decided to be a part of the problem. I was determined to be a part of the solution, to work with leaders in Congress, leaders at the Pentagon, leaders in law enforcement, to do our part to finish our work under the Constitution. But let me also say, I've spoken about this many times over the last 2 years. I communicated correspondence to the Congress and the American people on January 6th about the reasons for my actions. After the first 100 days of the Biden administration, I was back on the road, speaking about the differences the president and I had. And earlier this year, when the president once again said that he believed I had the right to overturn the election, I I made it clear that I had no right to overturn the election. That, in fact, there's no idea more un-American than the idea that any one person could choose the American president. So I've spoken over the course of the year, but I must tell you, it's a great privilege for me to have the opportunity to tell my story, literally from my upbringing in a small town in Indiana, being raised by a combat veteran and a precocious, red-headed, first-generation Irish American, to have met the girl of my dreams, to have stepped into the political arena early in life and learned lessons, but then had the privilege of being able to serve in the Congress as a conservative leader, to go home to Indiana, be a governor, and then the 4 consequential years of the Trump-Pence administration. And it was important for me to have the opportunity to put it all into context and also underpin it all with my faith. You know, the Bible says, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And in the immediate days after January 6th, I sought to do that. I prayed to do that. We still had the people's business to do until the end of the administration. But I'll be candid with you, it wasn't easy. And I continue to pray for the grace to be able to focus forward and to do my part to help move our country toward a more prosperous and peaceful future.
Do you, I mean, that day you were calling and trying to get the National Guard to come in and restore order. You were making those calls. Did you feel you had to do that because the commander-in-chief was derelict in his duties?
Margaret, I didn't know what the president was doing at the time. I wasn't at the White House. I had no contact with the president or the White House that day. But when I spoke to the congressional leaders in our first conference call, they informed me that they were getting mixed messages from security personnel. And I asked them if they wanted me to get involved, and they did. They asked me to see if I could get some answers, and so I began to make some calls. I was determined not to leave my post that day. I thought it was important for me to stay at the Capitol and to do whatever I could to facilitate a federal response. But I give credit to the leaders in both political parties that day, because on that very first call, there was a unanimous agreement that whatever needed to be done, we needed to reconvene the Congress that day and finish our work. I remember Speaker Pelosi telling me that she'd actually heard from one source that it could be up to 3 days before we could be back in the Capitol. And to all of their credit, the Democrat and Republican leaders all said that was completely unacceptable. I remember in that call, I reflected about an experience that 4 of us on the call had had in agreeing with the sentiment. And that was on September 11th, when I was a freshman member of Congress. I write about it in the book. I thought the best thing members of Congress did that day was that we reconvened on the steps of the Congress itself. We had a press event, but members broke into a spontaneous rendition of God Bless America. I thought that sent the right message to the nation and to the world on a day of unspeakable violence against the United States of America, that we were here, our government was intact. And I expressed that to the leaders on the call, 3 of whom had also been at that very same event on the steps of the Capitol. And they all were in complete agreement that whatever was necessary to be done, we had to reconvene that day. We had to show the American people and the world that we would complete our work under the Constitution of the United States and achieve the peaceful transfer of power for which our nation has celebrated the world over.
But what some people will hear from what you just said is you compared January 6th, the terrorist attacks on this country on 9/11. There was responsibility for those terrorist attacks on 9/11. Do you think President Trump needs to be held responsible in his events, in the events that led to January 6th and the violence of that day?
Well, I think everyone that perpetrated the violence at the Capitol needs to be held to the strictest account.
But what about those who fed it? What about those who gave it oxygen, the lie oxygen, to mislead people?
Well, what I would tell you is I'm confident that the American people will hold all those responsible at the end of the day, and history will be their judge. In my book, What I tried to do is share a candid story about the evolution of that controversy. You know, it's the president and I had
The president came
developed
to you at least 5 times. You lay it out in detail leading up to January 6th, and it's almost like you couldn't believe this because you kept telling him over and over, this is not legal, this is not constitutional.
did.
Do you
Many
look back
people
and
did.
say, I wasn't forceful enough? I mean, what could you have done differently, or was it just that he was so determined that fact was not useful?
Well, I did tell the president many times that after he exhausted every legal challenge that the campaign had every right to pursue, that he should simply accept the results. And my hope was that he would eventually come around before January 6th. You know, we had developed not just a close working relationship that I describe in the book, Margaret, but we had developed a friendship. The president and I were always candid with each other, but I always, whenever I had a difference of opinion with the president, I thought my role as vice president was to share that opinion in private. Mm-hmm. I believe it's the job of the vice president to be loyal to the president of the United States. The only higher loyalty you have is to God and to the Constitution, and that precipitated the confrontation that we had in and around January 6th. But all along the way, it was my hope that while the president was hearing from a cadre of attorneys who frankly should never have been left on the White House grounds, let alone in the Oval Office, telling him what, as the Bible says, his itching ears wanted to hear, my hope was that at the end of the day, he would come around. I remember on the night of January 4th, we had a meeting with the president and part of that legal team in the Oval Office. The president left on the helicopter. There were no harsh words between us, but he was continuing to make his case, and I was continuing to make my position clear. But at his rally in Georgia, which I watched on television, the president actually opened the rally by speaking about me, saying our great vice president's going to have to come through for us, adding that if Mike doesn't come through for us, I won't like him so much. But then he paused, and he said to the crowd, no, one thing you know about Mike Pence is he always plays it straight.
And then he called you the next day.
Well, but I remember in that moment thinking he might be coming around.
But he wasn't.
At the end of the day, he wasn't. And I leave that to others to explain why. But my continued hope was that at the end of the day, he would recognize what our duty was on that day as the presiding officer under the Constitution to oversee the count of the electoral vote of an election that we lost. But it was not to be.
Before I move on, I want to ask you, though, do you intend to ever sit and answer questions written in person for the January 6th committee? Do you believe, though, that the public deserves that? Is this interview it? Is this book it? Or will you answer questions about that day before Congress?
Well, I shared my heart and I shared my story in this book, and we'll continue to speak openly about it, I expect, to some degree for the rest of my life. But from the time that January 6th was formed, and every member was appointed by the Democrat Speaker of the House, I was concerned.
But your chief of staff spoke to them, Mark Short, your legal counsel, Greg Jacobs, testified.
I'll get to that. But
you don't want to engage with them at all?
No, I served for 12 years in the Congress. It's inconceivable to me that one party would appoint every member of a committee in Congress. That's antithetical to the whole idea of the committee system. Mm-hmm. That being said, I never stood in the way of senior members of my team cooperating with the committee and testifying. But Congress has no right to my testimony. We have a separation of powers under the Constitution of the United States. And I believe it would establish a terrible precedent for the Congress to summon a vice president of the United States to speak about deliberations that took place at the White House.
So you're closing the door on that entirely?
I'm closing the door on that. But I must say again that the partisan nature of the January 6th committee has been a disappointment to me. It seemed to me in the beginning there was an opportunity to examine every aspect of what happened on January 6th, and to do so more in the spirit of the 9/11 Commission, nonpartisan, non-political, and that was an opportunity lost.
Do you think Republicans are open to doing that, to have some self-reflection about January 6th?
Well, I'd leave that to others about the fate of the committee structure and decisions that would be made. But for my part, I think it's important, as I did on January 6th, that we uphold that separation of powers in the Constitution of the United States, two co-equal branches of government, and that's where we'll stand.
And so the lawyers and the chief of staff to the president at the time, the Mark Meadows, who let those lawyers, you said, had no business on the White House grounds, you think no consequence? Only prosecute the people who actually physically went to the Capitol?
Well, I know there are those that are speaking in defense of people that rioted at the Capitol and created the conditions where lives were lost. But I believe everyone that was rioting in the Capitol that day and perpetrating violence needs to be held to the strictest account of the law. I remember watching it unfold only on cell phones that we had in that parking garage in the Senate, and I was filled with indignation. It's the people's house. I'd served there for 12 years. I dreamed as a boy to someday be able to serve there, and I just remember thinking, not this, not here, not in America. And I truly do believe that it's one of the centerpieces of our law, that those that do the crime are responsible for the crime. But I do believe that at the end of the day, the American people will hold accountable those that permitted the circumstances around which January 6th was able to flourish into violence that day.
Throughout the book, you mentioned some of the more controversial episodes you had in exchanges with the former president. After Charlottesville, you said the president was not a racist, not a bigot, and the debate about a statue could indeed have well-meaning Americans on both sides. About the phone call that led to the first impeachment. After the president asked Ukraine's leader to investigate Hunter Biden, you said, "It was not how I approached interactions with foreign leaders, but the president had done nothing wrong." During the pandemic, when you were standing next to him and the president talked about using disinfectant to treat COVID, you described it as an unforced error. It sounds like you're excusing his behavior or enabling this behavior.
Or explaining what happened. We were in an environment where much of the national media simply assumed the worst about Donald Trump from the first day of our administration. I'll never forget
Were you more
walking out of
forceful
the Oval
behind
Office.
closed doors than you let on in this book?
Say again.
Were you more forceful behind closed doors?
The president, whenever the president and I had a difference of opinion, he knew my opinion. But I always shared it in private, as I think a vice president should. I mean, the American people don't elect two presidents. And the vice president's job is to be loyal to the president and to share his opinion directly and, I think, privately, to give the president his counsel. And I did. And I chronicle that some in the book. But I have to tell you, Margaret, as I started to say, it is extraordinary to me to think of the level of opposition that our administration faced literally from day one. The headline of the Washington Post on our inauguration day in 2017 was, "The quest to impeach Donald Trump starts today." You know, never in my lifetime, and you covered it as well as anyone in the national press, did I see the level of opposition. They even called themselves the resistance, that each and every day took the worst version of events and assumed the worst about everything. And in So Help Me God, what I try and do is explain my perspective on those incidents, whether it be in the campaign or in the course of our administration, where I believe our administration was understood, misunderstood, where things were mischaracterized. And but again, I was proud in those moments, nonetheless, to stand by the president. You know, as I say in the book,
you didn't have any misgivings? You're putting this on the press.
Let me speak about a couple of the incidents. Charlottesville, it's a place that's very very special to you as a UVA grad. I visited there last year to speak to students myself, and I paid my respects at the alley where we lost Heather Hare. A tragic day. But as I speak about that moment, I recite what the president said, but I express my regret that he had not specifically denounced the KKK, white supremacists, and white nationalists that had been present. So when I arrived in Columbia, I sought to do that. I squared my shoulders before the international media, stated our administration's position, and specifically rejected those groups, said they had no place in American public life. The president had denounced the extremists that were there in his first remarks, but he would go on within a day to denounce those groups explicitly. And as I said, the assertion that President Trump is an anti-Semite neglects the fact that he has Jewish grandchildren. His daughter and son-in-law are Jewish. And as I wrote in my book,
but the language
he's not
he
a bigot.
uses now is
He's not a
language,
racist. If he was, I would have never been his vice president.
But you admit the language he uses is not what you would use to
Well,
refer to
We were
people
very
who-
different men.
Yeah,
And
you could say that.
we were very different men, but
But you are giving him the Mike Pence stamp of approval when you say he's not a racist and not a bigot. That's what I'm asking you about.
what I'm telling you is that in all my time around him, when the cameras were off, I never saw the president mistreat anyone on the basis of race or creed or color. And I know that's hard to hear for some of his harshest critics, but it happens to be true. But it was just one of the criticisms that was leveled at the president in that time. Now, I would tell you, he and I were different people. He was elected on an agenda that I endorsed, but I think he was also elected with a style of politics that is different from mine. And as vice president, I thought my job was to stand by the president, to be loyal, and to support the presidency both in substance and in its efforts that he was elected to advance. And that's just what we did.
You've made clear that you also think the FBI executing a search warrant to take classified material from the former president's home was not the way the Justice Department should have handled it. But to be clear, were you ever personally concerned about Mr. Trump's handling of classified information? And for the record, do you think he can declassify just by thinking about it?
Well, I don't recall ever being concerned about the president or anyone on our administration's handling of classified information, at least among the senior staff, of which I had regular contact.
But if he had, he would be prosecuted, you would think.
Well,
I mean, certainly you talk about your family members who are in the military. If they took
Indeed.
classified material home, they would face steep consequences.
Well, let me say, no one is above the law. But as someone that served on the Judiciary Committee for more than 10 years, having oversight over the Justice Department, I just think there were many better ways to obtain those classified materials from Mar-a-Lago than to execute a search warrant against a former president of the United States of America, something that had never happened in American history, Margaret.
And never been prosecuted. Do you think that should happen?
Look, my hope is that the Justice Department will think very carefully about next steps. I mean, this is a very divided time in the life of our nation. I think our nation needs to heal. But the idea of executing a search warrant against a former president of the United States sent the wrong message to the American people, and frankly sent the wrong message to the wider world that looks at the United States of America as the standard. And that was my disappointment in the decision to execute a search warrant.
I know we're running out of time, but I do want to ask you about what you have talked about as restoring the sanctity of life, which was, you say, the calling of your life. I know this is very important to you, so if you'll let me, I want to ask you, you're very proud of the Supreme Court justices put on the court who just recently struck down Roe versus Wade. Do you think the decision on abortion access should stay in the states, or should there be a national law banning it?
Well, it's a fair question, but let me back up for 1 second. You know, the most important decision I ever made in my life that I recount in my book is when I put my faith in Jesus Christ. And as I opened up the Bible, I read that before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And an admonition to choose life so that you and your children may live. And from very early on in my public career, I was determined to be a champion for life. Whether it was in my years as a radio broadcaster, I advocated the right to life, or my time in the Congress of the United States, where I worked closely with the late Henry Hyde, who was the lion of the right to life. I just always purposed to advance the sanctity of life. And I always believed that Roe v. Wade would be sent to the ash heap of history. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that Ruth Bader Ginsburg even said, it was one of the great Supreme Court justices.
Well, she
of our
questioned
time.
the legal basis.
She
not
questioned the
being
legal
solid
foundation
enough.
of
But,
it, and
what,
she was right. But
does
my
what you're talking
perspective,
about, the moral imperative,
yes,
does that trump states' rights?
Well, the Dobbs decision this summer that I was so grateful to see, the majority of which was made up by Supreme Court justices that we appointed and confirmed to the court, really gave the country a new beginning for life. And it did return the question of abortion to the states and the American people. Many alarmists on the American left in the beginning spoke about it banning abortion and taking away the right. And actually, I think most Americans figured out pretty quickly that, in fact, this question that bears so deeply on the life of the nation had simply been returned to the people and their elected representatives. And so, for my part, I will tell you that I will always support efforts to strengthen protections for the unborn. I think it's most likely that it will be resolved at the state level, but the 15-week legislation in the Congress, had I been a member of Congress, I would have supported, because
That's
I think
not too
it actually—
liberal for you, because it would allow access up to 15 weeks of pregnancy.
Well,
that's where the majority of abortions are performed.
I would have supported it as a beginning because I thought it did a service of exposing the fact that while the Democrats speak about extremism among pro-life Americans, the truth is the Democratic Party supports abortion all the way up to the moment of birth and taxpayer funding of abortion. And that's a position that isn't supported by more than 25% of Americans. And so I thought there was usefulness in that debate, but
the 15-week, the Rubio-Graham bill, the 15 weeks you're talking about also has exceptions for life of the mother after the 15 weeks.
Right. And those, in support of the Hyde Amendment as a member of Congress, I supported those exceptions during my public career. But Margaret, I do believe it's more likely this is going to be resolved at the state level. It may take as long to restore the sanctity of life to the center of American law in all 50 states as it did to overturn Roe versus Wade. But people that know me and my family know that so long as we live, we'll seek to be about the business of life in this country and doing our part to support the sanctity of life.
I was interested to read that you and your wife, Karen, underwent IVF therapy. And so
many times.
And there are, which is a lot to go through. And there are people who are concerned that if you start with abortion access restrictions, that it will also lead to restrictions on IVF treatment. If you believe life begins at conception, you can make that argument. Should it be protected as a right?
Oh, Karen and I struggled for more than 5 years with unexplained infertility. And in fact, I'll never forget the day that I called home, driving off to a work appointment, and Karen answered the phone and said, "Happy Father's Day." And our son would come along, then a daughter, then another daughter, all within 3 years. And we were busy but joyful. But in the midst of all of that, we also received word that we had made the list for an adoption for a young woman with an unexpected pregnancy. And, you know, Margaret, we prayed a lot about that. I write about it in the book. I believe in forever families. I believe families can be formed by adoption as much as by natural birth. But we wanted to find out if the second family on the list was clinically infertile. And when we did, we stepped aside, not wanting to prevent them from having the joy of a little one in their home. But I fully support fertility treatments, and I think they deserve the protection of the law. They gave us great comfort in those long and challenging years that we struggled with infertility in our marriage. And I do believe as we work our way forward, we can protect the unborn, we can come alongside women in crisis pregnancies, and we can support the newborn with equal vigor. And that's the challenge that I'll be articulating all across this country to leaders in cities large and small, that if we come with principle and compassion for the unborn, for newborns, for mothers with unexpected pregnancies, we can win the cause of life in America.
What about same-sex marriage? A number of Republicans are getting on board federal protections for it. Do you believe that you need to consider that when you talk about compassion? Well,
as a Bible-believing Christian, I'll always hold the view that marriage is between one man and one woman. I think it was ordained by God, and that'll always be my values. But the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled on this in the Obergefell case. And
so you don't think a federal law is needed, like a number of Republicans
We can
are now?
disagree with Supreme Court decisions, but we can't disobey them. I respect the pronouncements of the court. And I actually think it's just as important as we go forward as a nation that we make it clear that we don't believe in discrimination against anyone because of who they are, who they love, or what they believe. But at the same time, I think we need to make sure that we protect the religious freedom of every American that's enshrined in the Constitution, the ability to live, to work, to worship in a manner according to the dictates of your conscience. And I think we're getting there. I think we're moving forward as a nation, and I look forward to continuing to express my values, but express them with compassion for every American, whether they share my values or not.
And I have to let you go, but sir, I have to ask, why would you want to be President of the United States?
Margaret, many years ago, a mentor of mine said, there's two kinds of people in Washington, D.C. There's people that are called and people that are driven. And if you read my book, So Help Me God, you'll see that I've been both. Early in my career, I let my ambition get ahead of what I thought my Christian faith required of me. And I wrote about my disappointment in the campaigns that I'd run. But when the opportunity came back around 10 years later with 3 little kids, having just built our dream home, Karen and I went to prayer and reflected on what our calling might be. And when we stepped forward to run for Congress the year we were elected in 2000, it was not so much out of a sense of ambition or entitlement, but it was out of a sense of calling. We felt called to be a part of new leadership coming to Washington, D.C., in the Congress and in the White House. We felt called to go home and run for governor of Indiana. And when the call came in 2016, we reflected, we prayed, and we believed that we could make a difference. And we said yes to Donald Trump and joined the national ticket. And I'll always be proud of the work that we did during the Trump-Pence administration. But what I can tell you is that for me and for my house, as we consider however we might contribute to the life of the nation in the years ahead, we'll be trying to discern through prayerful reflection, consideration, speaking to family and friends, and listening to the American people, what our calling might be. Ronald Reagan said one time, the American people have a funny way of letting you know if they want you to run for president. So we'll be listening, we'll be praying, and we'll be deciding what our role might be in the days ahead.
Days ahead? I thought we had to wait till January. You have news you want to make with us, sir?
Not today.
Not today. Okay. Thank you for your time,
Thank
Mr.
you,
Vice
Margaret.
President. Appreciate it.